episode 107 of In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. In this episode, Captain Jesse is back to help us start the roving horde armada. We're your hosts, Aaron
and Jason.
And you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Before we dive in today, I know the show is late. I had some travel come up for work that I did not plan appropriately for. The importance of planning. And as if right on cue, as soon as I got back, I got a cold. I know there's some of you that have written in with some really great requests for being on the show. Just know that I do have your requests. I'm not ignoring you. I just haven't been able to get to them. I am going to start going through those requests here in the next week and getting back in touch with people and getting some great interviews scheduled for the show. Anyway, enough about all that. Let's get on with the show. All right, so we are joined again by Jesse, who has graciously agreed to come in and do a part two because we had so much fun on the first sailing episode, and there is so much to know. This definitely required a part two. So, Jesse, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad to come back. I had a lot of fun last time as well.
Awesome. And Jason's here this time. He woke up and showed up, on time.
Well, hey, they weren't, so I just slept in. Anyways.
Awesome. So we got, so Jesse, you came up with some great stuff for us this time to get a deeper down the rabbit hole of sailing. So what you had, you said you came up with some stuff more about boats in general that we should know.
Yeah, I was just thinking, if somebody was actually considering going about getting a sailboat as kind of a bug-out plan, there's a couple of basic things I think people should look at. We did talk a little bit about, difference between multi and monohull and a lot of that stuff. But I think, as far as just looking at basic, what is a minimum boat that you'd want to get? I think you'd want to look at a monohull in the 25 to 35-foot range, and the main reason for that would be cost. You can probably pick up a monohull from the 70s in that size range for under 10 grand.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And then, with that, you're going to get a lot of minimum stuff that I think is enough to start building on. For instance, that's going to have at least 20 gallons of water storage. You're going to have some basic electrical, which would give you things like navigation lights, anchor lights, probably some interior lights, and a bilge pump and some power to run things like a VHF ship-to-shore radio or ship-to-ship radio. You'll probably also have some way to cook. A lot of those boats in that size range have things like a propane stove or a propane grill, or maybe an alcohol stove, things that, on the line of camping type stoves that you've probably seen in backpacking magazines and stuff like that, but you can use them on boats as well. Engine-wise, I'd really recommend an inboard versus an outboard. There's practical reasons for that. Inboard engines do better in poor conditions. So when the waves really start to churn up and you're in some big waves, outboard engines can do what's called cavitate. They come right out of the water. You don't get any forward momentum. They're not actually pushing the hull at all, and you don't make progress, and you can actually get yourself in some bad situations, especially near rocky coastlines and stuff like that. And that would leave, things like having a head, a bathroom, and refrigeration. That's all kind of comfort stuff. You can do without it. There's still lots of people out there sailing really primitive sailboats that, there's people still using kerosene lamps for navigation lights. I wouldn't personally do it because it's a lot more work, in my opinion, than having, just a basic electrical system. But, if you take the electrical system off the boat, that's one less thing to maintain.
That's definitely true. That actually leads to I would imagine, a lot of stuff that you don't have to deal with. I would imagine electrical becomes problematic, which I think we're actually going to get to in a little while, but it would seem like there's a lot of problematic issues with electrical.
Oh, yeah. It's one of those systems that you spend a fair amount of time maintaining just to use at a basic level. If you could find a way to do without it, you could open up a lot of free time.
Interesting. Okay. I have a bunch of questions around that, but I want to save those for a little while and keep on the more generalized topic of picking out boats and stuff. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. Keep going on.
Oh, no problem. So just kind of looking, I just pulled up Craigslist in my area, in the Boston area, just kind of looked for boats. Looking in that range, I found a Cape Dory 25. It's for 7,000, and a Cal 27 for 7,500. Both of these are mid to late 70s boats. Both of these boats would be, plenty adequate to have as kind of a basic platform. You could learn how to sail. You could learn how to maintain systems. And in a pinch, it can take probably 4 people out of Dodge if you have to go. You could store enough food and water and supplies in that boat for 4 people to live. I wouldn't say comfortably. You're going to be right in each other's area all the time, but you could do it with 4 people.
Here was another question, and Jason, I think you and I were trying to figure this out a while back, which is, at what size of a boat does it become more than realistically one person can handle?
I guess a lot of that depends on how it's set up. A well set up 50 to 60 footer could be sailed solo.
Oh, wow.
But ones I've seen, my slip neighbor has a 30 footer that is almost impossible to sail solo. It's just a very technical racing boat. It has lots of different controls in far-reaching areas of the boat, so you can't really do it easily with one person. You really need at least 3 or 4. But I've handled with just myself and one other person boats in the the mid-40s ranges, and didn't find them at all cumbersome. I'd be comfortable going up to like a 50-footer by myself. After that, I think it's too big to really deal with easily. I mean, even in the 40s, when you start looking at having to maneuver it in small spaces by yourself, it can become difficult.
What parts of it actually become difficult?
Well, for instance, if you're going to pull up to a dock to get fuel, when you're going to pull up to the dock, you're going to be at the helm, you're going to be controlling the motor and the steering. Then you also have to run, kind of throw it into neutral, try to coast into the area, run and get a line on the dock so that you don't float past where you're trying to go. That type of stuff gets difficult. From a sailing perspective, it's usually not that bad. Most boats now have what's called roller furlers on the head sail. It's a system where you wrap the sail around that front wire, like the old window shade, so you don't actually have to put it up and down anymore. It literally just pulls out, and then there's another line that you can pull to pull it back in. So getting that sail out and set is very easy. Most main sails, most boats now have what's called cabin top winches. So right in the main cockpit, on top of the cabin top, right on either side of the companionway you just go down, there's winches right there. So if you're from the helm to those, you're only probably 2 or 3 feet that you have to move to be able to work those. And that's how you put the mainsail up and control the mainsail. So they're pretty easy to do in that perspective. They can be made even easier depending on how you want to set it up. The boat we chartered in the British Virgin Islands last year, everything led right back to 2 helm stations. So it had a wheel on each side of the boat, but it had redundant lines on each side so that one person could sail that boat by himself all day without any problem. And that was a 43-foot boat that was just set up very well.
Huh. So did the dual the dual helms, does that add a level of redundancy, or is it if one breaks, they both break kind of?
It actually does add a level of redundancy in most boats. It depends on how they set it up. In this particular one, it does add redundancy. And really the reason they do it is because modern boat designs are so wide that in order to have a single wheel where you can be out on the edge of the boat, because that's where you want to sail. You don't generally sail from the middle of the boat because you can't see past the sails if you're in the middle of the boat.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to get out on the edge so you're looking underneath the sail and looking forward. Or on the other side, up on what's called the windward side, the high side of the boat, where you're looking over the top of the sail. So if you were in the middle, you'd need like a 90-inch wheel, which there just isn't space for. So that's why a lot of those modern boats have gone to the dual helms. And even in the ones where you're starting to see at the boat shows now, boats in like the high 30s having dual helms, because that's more convenient than having a single like 48-inch wheel.
Okay. That's pretty interesting. I know even I think there was a couple of catamarans that I looked at, and they had dual, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I was trying to figure out what the real purpose was. So, but
most catamarans I've seen actually only have single helm, so
yeah,
dual helm on catamarans is fairly rare.
Yeah, it wasn't like an often thing, and it seemed like it was some of the very, very new boats.
Yeah, they usually, most of the catamarans that I've been on, it's a single helm, and it's usually off on typically the starboard side for some reason. I don't know why that's the one that they pick. Maybe it's just more common that people dock on that side.
Interesting. Okay. And you had some other stuff you were going to talk about as far as like experience and dealing with getting educated as a sailor and things like that.
Yeah, I remember we touched on this at the last show where you'd asked about taking classes. And I kind of said I don't really believe in the classes. And that is an odd position, for somebody to take, obviously. But it's one of those things where learning how to sail is really the easiest part of the whole thing. If you have a small boat and you get out there in the middle of the ocean with nothing else around, play around with it for a couple hours, you'll have that boat moving. You may not have it moving the fastest or at the most efficient angle, but unless you're racing, a lot of that stuff doesn't necessarily matter.
Right.
If you can make the boat move and you can get it going at a decent speed, and then just through experience playing around and tweaking the setup of the sails, how far you have it pulled in, how much you let it go out, and just kind of reading a little bit of basic books on how you trim the sails. And like if your jib's luffing, which means it's starting to move back and forth in the wind as opposed to have that bowed shape being held strong, you can learn that typically that means you're either sailing too close to the wind or you have your sail too far out. You need to just pull that sheet in a little bit more, and through experimentation, you can figure that stuff out pretty quickly.
My understanding was that particularly the more modern boats, particularly like say the catamarans, they actually kind of undersail them so that there's not a significant amount of danger of flipping the boat. Is that true?
Yeah, and you see that with pretty much most modern boats now, because when you get into boats like mine that have a really wide beam compared to their length, like my boat's 31 feet long, but it's 12 feet wide.
Huh.
It sails very much like a catamaran in many regards, because what you want to do is you want to have the least amount of sail up as you can.
Right.
So if you get into over 20 knots of wind, you want to reef that thing down so that you're not going to get pushed over quickly. The catamarans and modern design hulls have less riding momentum than the older design full keel boats, but they also go faster and carry more weight and a lot of other benefits to them.
The newer boats, that is.
Yes.
Okay. So what is it they're making the boats wider and that's allowing them to go faster and carry more weight, or?
Yeah, there's a whole thing in sailboat design where one of the key things you try to balance is initial stability versus overall stability. And the newer boats have really good initial stability. So what that would mean is if you go out in 15 knots of wind, you might only heel my boat over like 10, maybe 15 degrees max, where if you go over in an older full keel boat, that same amount of wind may heel you over to like 20, 25.
Wow.
But when the wind kicks up to 20 degrees, 20 knots, my boat's going to heel over to 20 degrees and feel very uncomfortable, while the old boats are going to stay in that 20 to 25 range and feel very solid. So, they have this balance between having this tippy feeling initially when there's very little wind to then solidifying up because you've reached a point where the boat is really designed to sail, versus newer boats, which are designed more towards sailing in lighter conditions, which means you have to reef sail earlier.
Okay.
I don't know if that made sense to non-sailors.
Yeah, I think for the most part, I think it did. And I think one of the other things we were talking about as far as what kind of size you really need for two people or even three people on a boat, where it's actually not even just about controlling the boat, but also just being comfortable on the boat and being able to get out of each other's hair.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is going to be kind of personal choice. As I mentioned on the last show, my wife and I are on a 31-foot boat, and we're comfortable in that size. We found ways to get our own space and get away from each other when we need to. I know people who sail in 25-foot boats that find similar ways to get away from each other. And then if I was going with another couple or another person, I would want 2 separate cabins where you have doors that you can kind of close off so that your bedroom space becomes your kind of private space.
Mm-hmm.
But, you can get that set up in, there's 32-foot boats that I've been on that have a forward cabin and an aft cabin that have doors that you can get that separate space and you'd be comfortable on. It's just a matter of looking around at the different designs and finding what works for you.
Got it.
Okay, that makes sense. Since we touched on it earlier, do you want to go ahead and dive into electrical now, or did you want to touch on some more stuff with the basics of just picking out a boat?
Yeah, no, that was kind of what I want to talk about just picking it out. And then the next thing I was going to say is after you get it out, then you start thinking about, what you're going to put on it. Especially the best thing to do is if you have the time is get the boat, get it in the water, live with it for a season before you start making any major upgrades to see what you like and what you don't like. Experience is going to tell you that better than anything.
My, I guess, major question has always really been, how big of a boat do you need if you're planning on, say, sailing around the Caribbean, or not necessarily a full around the world, but say sail down to Hawaii, then over, say, to some of the Polynesian islands, and then back to the United States?
There's people sailing very small boats in that. I remember reading one account of people that had, I think it was called a Pearl 21. It was essentially a large canoe with a sail on it, and they sailed all around the Caribbean.
Wow.
So the boats can generally handle more than you can. It's a matter of how much stuff do you really want to take with you.
Right. But see, as a prepper, that's where I'm kind of going towards, is as a typical kind of prepper, all the gear that we generally load out, come on, we're gear freaks. And let's say we have, 2 couples. I mean, that's kind of where, whenever I was having conversations with Aaron about it, I was like, man, we really need to look into a catamaran, because that'll have definitely 2 definitive sides of the boat, that we can get away from each other, and then we could have our own kind of separate spaces. But then we have that big common area in the middle to kind of share. Just how much weight-wise, size-wise, would a typical type of a 2-couple prepper need?
So, again, a lot of this comes to how you prep. Personally, my prep is I take skills over gear. But I know plenty of people who go the other way and have no issue with it. Mm-hmm. It's all personal choice. But I would say that if you're looking at 2 couples, you want high 30s minimum. And that's high 30s in a mono hull. We talked about this a little bit on the last show, but mono hulls can actually generally carry more weight than the catamaran.
Got it.
So one of the misconceptions is you get this big catamaran, you can load it full of stuff. If you do that, you actually put yourself in a more dangerous position than if you load a big mono hull full of stuff.
Got it.
So if you're really looking, how much stuff can I take with me and how big of a boat do I need, you're going to get more bang for your buck going for something like a Catalina 400, which is a 40-foot boat, will cost you around $120,000, I believe, maybe $150,000. It'll cost you the same amount of money as something like, say, a Leopard 38, but you're going to be able to carry more weight, which means, more stuff that you'll be more gear, more supplies that you can take with you.
Right.
The big thing on boats is, a lot of people, when they're looking at how they allocate their resources, the number one resource that they look at as prepping is money. Mm-hmm. On boats, it's weight. You really have to watch weight with that's your biggest resource that you have to manage, because you can only carry so much weight.
Right.
So by the time you put your safety gear on the boat, which is first and foremost the thing that you got to load, so that's stuff like extra anchors and rode, flares and horns and signaling devices, having maybe 2 or 3 types of communication radios, life jackets, maybe some storm sails, stuff like that. Then you'd start looking at spare parts. If you're going to be going to the Caribbean or even further, you have to worry about, do I have enough spare oil filters, fuel filters, all of those different parts. All of those things are going to take up a fair amount of weight. You have to figure out how much weight you're willing to dedicate to those things, and then where you get your best bang for your buck. I know cruisers who carry almost an entire spare engine. I think that's a bit crazy, but there are people that go to that extreme. Then you have to start thinking about the electrical system, and we'll touch on that. Mm-hmm. My batteries, I have two what's called 4D batteries. They're large interstate. They were actually supposed to be deep cycle, but they're really not true deep cycle batteries. They weigh 140 pounds apiece.
Wow.
So there's 280 pounds that go right out my budget just on my back. And I actually have a third battery, which weighs about 30 pounds, because I have those two that are tied for my main power system, and then I have a backup just in case anything happens in this other small battery.
Okay. Let me backtrack for just a second, because this is making a very interesting point about weight. How do you budget around the weight? I mean, I guess are there, and not to get into them, because it would probably end up being a little more technical than probably we want to get into today, but I guess I'm guessing there are equations. You look at a boat, it's about this size, it's about this geometry, and you figure out, okay, I can put this much weight on the boat, and then from there, do you literally weigh everything on the boat and kind of scratch off, okay, well, I only got, 500 pounds left I can put on the boat or whatever?
Yeah, so every boat, you really can't go by straight dimensions because hull shape comes into it as well. Mm. But the manufacturer of every boat will publish what's called their immersion curve, or the pounds per square inch of immersion. So, for instance, on my Catalina, now I'm drawing a blank, I believe I'm 1,175 pounds per inch. So the boat comes, you have it in the water, you know that's how much pounds it's going to eat for each. And again, that counts people as well. So that counts your own body weight, whoever else is sailing with you's body weight, like dog, all of that goes into that same pool of weight. So you start thinking about, all right, I have the boat right here. It's set up. Let me fill the water tanks and let's see where my water line is. All right, now let's start putting some gear on the boat that I like, and you see where your water line is again. And generally what it is you paint it on the side of your boat, on the bottom of your boat, the bottom paint, the anti-fouling paint. You know where your water line is from what's called your scum line from last year when you were in the water. You know where generally a lot of boats will put what's called a boot stripe along the bottom. And you're not supposed to have that boot stripe in the water. If that's in the water, you have a problem. So you'll have 3 inches, maybe 4 inches between where your boat sits when it first goes in the water and the top of your safe water. So generally that means you have somewhere between, 3, maybe 4,000 pounds that you can put on a boat. But that's everything. And again, that's your fuel, your water, all of that stuff. So the way that I handle mine is the first thing I'll do when I get in the water is I'll start filling up my water tanks, my fuel tanks, see where my boat sits. Then I'll start putting on gear and seeing, all right, this is all the gear I want to put on. Let's put it all on and see how we sit. And if I put all my gear on and I see that I only have like an inch of water line left, I know I've put too much gear on the boat. And I got to start peeling it back. Because I haven't put food on it yet, my body weight's not on it yet, my wife's, all of that stuff that goes into it. And that's kind of how you deal with it with boats. Instead of that, you could go through and actually measure everything, but it's a lot easier just to look at your water line and see where it sits and know how much weight from that you can do a rough calculation of how much you put on there and how much you have left to put on.
Oh, okay. All right. That's a lot easier because, I'm thinking, what do you get out spreadsheets and start calculating things and weigh things? And because I'm anal retentive, but that's just me.
I was going to say there are people that do that. The big item that usually the wife and I get into discussions about is shoes. She really likes having shoes, and at any given time I could have 10 or 15 pairs of flip-flops on the boat. and I start arguing with her about how much weight that takes up. And it's a losing argument every time. I don't know why I do it to myself.
Okay, I gotta ask: Are there really that many different types of? I'm asking a dumb question. I know that. Are there really 15 different kinds of flip flops? I mean, are there dressy flip flops, and then there's casual flip flops, and
oh, absolutely, oh yeah, and then there's. So she's got like flip-flops that she'll wear on the beach when we're walking in mud, and there's flip-flops that she'll wear when we're going out to a nice dinner. She's got multiple layers of these things.
Okay.
Women. She loves her shoes. I can't complain.
I understand. You got to make sure they match the outfit, though.
Yeah, that's
so I understand.
All right. Even myself, I will generally have 3 pairs of shoes, maybe 4 on a boat.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have a pair of just kind of basic flip flops. I'll have a pair of like Keens that are more like a hiking pair, like so that if you go over, I do have a pair of hiking boots generally on the boat, but you almost have to get to land and then put them on because you're always going in by boat, so you're always getting a little wet. Mm-hmm. So you don't want to go in on your hiking boots and then get them wet and then hike around in them because that would just be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I've done that before. Wet, soggy hiking boots is unpleasant.
And then as much as I'm trying to resist these shoes lately, I do have Crocs that I keep on the boat. They're so stupid. They're so ugly, but they're very utilitarian.
Man, I am a big fan of Crocs, man. Aaron is constantly he's like, God, those things are ugly. I'm like, but they're comfortable and they're cool, man. And they wash off.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of making fun of Jason's Crocs. So, God, they're ugly.
I used to wear my Crocs all the time until I saw that really bad movie, The Dictator.
Oh, I still haven't seen that yet, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
And there's a scene in that movie where he goes, "You're wearing sweatpants and Crocs. That's the universal sign of a man who's given up."
Yeah, I could see that.
So once I saw that, the Crocs started coming out less and less. But they are a very good boat shoe. They're actually they actually were made as a boat shoe. They're non-marking soles.
Right.
So they won't actually mark the hull when you're walking around on them, but at the same time they're completely water resistant. I can wear them stepping off the dinghy into the water, and I don't have to worry about them getting muddy or anything. I can just hose them off when I get back to the boat, or just dip them in the ocean. So they're very practical from that standpoint, but you just can't bring yourself to wear them anymore.
Yeah.
The only problem that I found with them, and this is probably more of a problem here in Texas, heat. If you leave them out in the sun, they're gone. They will shrink.
I've never seen that. That's
yes.
a big thing.
That is, I've never actually asked or looked it up. Is that what deck shoes are about, is not marking the deck?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not marking the deck, plus generally they have a sole pattern that's been designed to grip the boat. I wear Sperry boat shoes. I have actually like loafer style ones that I wear to work, but they have soles on there that are like these small little openings that flex, and they'll actually grip the deck much better than like a sneaker will.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I mean, I just assumed, but I hate assuming things, so I just thought I'd ask. I also just like to ask dumb questions or simplistic questions sometimes. But moving on to more complicated questions, let's get into the electrical stuff, because that's kind of interesting. I think we're even going to get into some rather common prepper topics to begin with, like solar and things like that. But I have one like kind of random question. So do you find that a lot of sailors are actually changing out their electrical, or at least their lighting systems, to switch over to like LEDs and stuff like that?
Oh, yeah, that's a huge topic among sailors. So we have generally 3 different types of lights on a boat. You'll have what's called your navigation lights. In order to be legal, you have to have a blue and a red light on your bow, and you have to have a white light that's seen 360 degrees around your boat. It could be accomplished by 2 or 3 lights, or it could just be 1 light. Then you also have to have what's called your anchor light, which is the highest light on the boat. It's a solid white light, and it's, again, seen from 360. And then down below, you'll have your typical cabin lighting to read by or just to work and maneuver by. And generally, at some point in time, almost all of it's going to be on during the course of the night. Because if you're anchored, you're going to have your anchor light on all night. So that a lot of people, that was one of the first lights I switched over to LED, because it used the most power because it was on the most.
Mm-hmm.
And then the cabin light came next. Navigation lights for us, we don't tend to do a ton of night sailing. Like we'll go out and come back like just after dark a lot. So we're only using those lights for maybe an hour or 2 each time we do that. And it's not that common of an occurrence. It's maybe like twice a month type of thing. So it's not something that we're too concerned about that power usage. But as we move to heading down south, that's going to be something we're going to be using a lot more, and I'm going to switch those out to LEDs as well. And then the cabin light, there's so many different kinds of LEDs that have been made for cabin lights for boats, where you can get things from like that blue kind of traditional LED light, and now they have things that are more like warm light type, where it gives you more of that natural light feel. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of different lights, and people might have, like for instance, I have 7 different light fixtures down below on my boat. I'm looking at 2 different types of LED bulbs because there's 4 lights that are specifically reading lights. So those I would want a much brighter, more intense light. And then the other ones I'd want more of a kind of a general light that doesn't get so bright and intense. And then a lot of the lights now also have a red light feature, which is really important if you do any night sailing, because you don't want to have a really harsh bright light on down below. So if you go down below to check on something and you come back up, your night vision.
Yeah, because it's like takes 20 minutes for your night vision to come back once you've been in bright light, I think.
Really?
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff you could hit in 20 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So a lot of boats, a lot of people now are going to these other LEDs, which is like you hit the button twice, and it'll put on a soft red light so that you don't lose your night vision when you go down below.
Oh, that's cool.
And even like, so in my boat, it came from the factory with just regular incandescent bulbs. The one in the bathroom in the head is a red if you flip the switch one way, and then white if you flip it the other way, because they figured that's the one that people would most use at night while sailing.
It's amazing the subtleties that, especially stuff like that they think through when they're making things. I mean, when I was in architecture, we'd do the same kind of, it was these little subtleties, just even in construction materials and everything else that you'd think of that most people would never stop to even consider. So little things like that, like worrying about whether or not the head has the ability to do white light versus red light, is kind of an interesting one.
Yeah, it's like at first it kind of caught me off guard. Like our last boat just had 2 lights on it, 2 fixed lights, and they were both reading lights. So that it wasn't for a cabin light. We just had like a small LED lantern that ran on like 4 AA batteries, and you just hang it from the middle of the cabin. And we'd think nothing of it. Then we got the new one, and I started playing around with all the switches. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. It goes to red. I'm like, I don't know why you want mood lighting in the head, but and then you start going around going, oh yeah, this is why they put it there. This is why this is set up that way. And they did put a lot of thought in things like that. The handholds is another thing you'll see throughout the cabin, where they thought, if I'm standing at the counter trying to cook a meal, I need a handhold, so I'm going to put one right here.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So now, how big of a pain in the butt is it? Because I know last time we were talking about how the production boats are made in a factory, and it's almost like a clamshell, and then once they've wired everything up, they stick everything back together. So does going back to try to rewire stuff become a giant pain in the ass?
It can very much be a huge pain in the ass if they didn't do the initial wiring right. For starters, almost everything on your boat is going to run on 12-volt electricity instead of 120 volt. You know, we're used to, with 120 volt, you don't really think about how much signal loss you're going to have or how hot that wire is going to get. And if you're trying to put a lot of electricity through a thin wire, with 120 volt, you don't have the same heat issues that you do with 12 volt. When you start getting over to 12 volt, you have to start thinking about sizing the wire that you're running. And if the initial boat builder put really small wire in, they just thought, well, I'm just going to put this for this one light, and I don't care if somebody wants to expand in the future. Mm-hmm. You know, now you have to run a whole new run.
Okay, so it's kind of they'll cheap out on you, and
right.
Okay, and you've got to put a bigger gauge wire, go back and rerun a bigger gauge wire.
Yes. So, like, to run an LED light, you could probably get away with something like a 14 or 12 gauge wire on most 12-volt systems. When you consider the length, you have to consider both sides. So if it's physically 30 feet from your battery, or actually the post where all your power is distributed, you have a distribution panel. So if it's actually 30 feet from your distribution panel to that light, you have to count that rung as 60 feet. So there's sizing charts that you can look at and say, okay, this light uses 5 amps. It's 60 feet round trip for me to get there. This is my minimum size wire.
I never thought of it like that at all.
Yeah, and it's a different way of thinking. Like when I did a bunch of work in my house, it's just, you either ran, like 10 gauge or 12 gauge, and it's solid strand. On boats, everything is stranded wire, and you also want it to be tinned copper wire. You don't want just straight copper wire because copper corrodes very easily in a marine environment. You need the tinning on it to help with it being more resistant to that corrosion.
Oh, see, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, I would have never thought of that because I would have just think straight copper wire.
And that's why a lot of times you'll hear like, oh, this is a marinized stereo for your boat. And people are like, oh, that's just a gimmick to get more money. Well, it's not totally just a gimmick. It is, if it's done right, it's actually tinned copper wire, and they do the connections inside a little different so that they're more sealed and all kinds of things like that.
Okay, yeah, I just figured it. I have actually seen that designation. My dad's big into bass fishing, and so and not too long ago, he was looking for a new radio for his boat, and it was the cost difference between the two, and I just figured it had to do with sealing. I didn't even think about the fact that it might have had to do with a different kind of alloy or anything else for the components of the radio.
Yeah, that's why sometimes with marine stuff, you have to dive in a little bit deeper. Like 12-volt fans, you can get 12-volt fans that are made to work in cars or long-haul trucks, and they're just made with straight copper wire, and they seem like a great deal at first. They're a third of the price of the marine one. Well, they only last a year or two because the corrosion gets into them, and then they stop working. It wasn't a great deal.
Yeah, exactly. When you're having to buy a new one every year, that's... Wow. Okay. That's again, that's one of those subtleties that I would have never thought about.
So what all do you need to do to help prevent the corrosion level? Is that part of just the general maintenance of a boat?
Yeah, well, it's part of how boats are made and how you go about adding new connections or fix or repairing old ones. So, for instance, you have the tinned copper wire that's ran everywhere. Generally, production boats, and we kind of talked about this, where there's some boats that are production, some are custom, and then there's a few that are called semi-custom. But a production boat is a factory-made boat like my Catalina. When they made that, they ran good tinned copper wire, but then they did the connections with your standard crimp connects that you'd find in a regular electrical supply house. They weren't tinned. They didn't have heat shrink seals or anything like that. So one of the maintenance items I'm working on is every time I find an electrical component that stops working, I'm replacing the end with new connectors that are actually marine-grade connectors with heat shrink, and they have tinned copper connectors on them so that you don't have the corrosion issue. So I already have the good wire. I just had bad connectors. That's why I would have some things that would fail.
Oh, okay. Let's get into power generation. How effective is, I guess, the two that I've seen, and I'm sure there's probably more, but the two I've seen have been what looks like small windmills, and then the other one is obviously solar. So I guess let's start with solar since it's probably the one people are most familiar with. How well does solar actually do on a boat, and do you end up with the same situation where you have to buy the marine grade solar panels that are probably a lot more expensive because of corrosion issues?
The solar panels, the internal wiring, you'll know, isn't very exposed, so there isn't really an issue with that. It's more the connectors that you put on them. So a lot of times you'll see the same panel sold as a marine and a non-marine version, and it's really just the wires and the connectors that go into it. And that's stuff that you could change out if you wanted to, if it was that much of a price savings. It's probably not going to be. So you're not really going to go through that effort. But solar panels are very efficient right now, and I know somebody with the same size boat as mine. He has two 85-watt solar panels, and that generates all the power he generally needs in the Bahamas right now. He's down there. He leaves his boat down there now year-round, and he hasn't really had to run a generator or hook up to shore power. He might run his diesel engine to use the alternator to power on cloudy days or if there's been a few cloudy days in a row. But the solar has really come a long way, and there's actually a lot of people now who are ditching things like the wind generators because of other issues with those and going with more solar instead.
What was the issue with the wind generators?
One of the primary ones is noise. So you're on a boat kind of out in the middle of the ocean, and all night long there's a whoop, whoop, whoop noise going on. It just kind of keeps a lot of people awake. There's also the other issue where a lot of those wind generators have a very finite range that they generate power. So if the wind is too light, they're not going to generate any power. And if it's too strong, you're going to have to tie it all up so it's not spinning, or else you'll wear out the bearing.
Oh, I thought, because I know like the big windmills have essentially clutches in them that kick into place when the wind speed goes up too high. I guess the ones meant for sailing don't have that, and you've actually got to manually tie the thing up.
Yeah, a lot of them don't necessarily have those clutches, or I know like some windmills will also change the pitch of their blades in order to have them not spin as fast. You really don't get into that unless you get into some really expensive high-end wind generators.
Okay. Gotcha. Yeah, because I would have thought a wind generator on a boat would have been like awesome.
and I think everybody had that initial thought, and I know I initially did before I started researching it. And I was thinking, I'll throw a couple panels up there, I'll throw a couple wind generators, and I'll never have to worry about power again. And then I researched them, and I realized the wind generators just don't quite seem to be there yet. There are some people that are happy with them, but there are people that are willing to deal with, pay attention if the wind's going to be too strong. They have to take them down or at least tie them up. If the wind's too light, they just don't generate the amount of power that you needed. And again, more and more people, when you look at that allocation of resources and you look at the weight, the amount of weight that you could use to put more solar up there seems to be a better return on investment than wind generators right now.
Okay.
There are some current generators too, which I think is a really cool concept, but again, it's not there yet, where you have something that looks like a wind generator and you can drop it overboard either when you're anchored in a high tidal current zone or river, or if you're actually out under sail, and it would turn in the water and generate power.
Hydropower generators, that's a cool idea.
Yeah. There's some other. Is it where it's actually turning blades, or is it the power generation where it's actually bobbing up and down?
Turning blades. These ones they have some that are even hybrid, where when you're sailing, you can drop them down so that they're turning in the water behind your boat sailing, and then when you're anchored, you can put them up into the wind, and they'll be a wind generator.
Oh, okay. All right. That's pretty interesting. Yeah, I know there's another one that I don't know if they've made it small ones yet, but I know there are actually some pretty big ones that essentially bob and use the motion of the waves to create energy. But I had no idea if there were not energy, electricity. I had no idea if those were being employed in any way in the sailing world or not.
No, I haven't seen anything come up with that type of technology yet. Although because you're always in an area where you're going to have some of that motion, you would think it's something that would come around pretty soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I mean, generally with boats, what you try to do is you try to size your batteries so that you have somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 days of power just on your battery. So, for instance, I have, some of us that are kind of on the geek side will have spreadsheets where I have all of my electrical components listed out, how much power they use, how many hours they're on average per day. And then you can add that all up and say, okay, here's my daily budget of what I expect to use for power. So here's what battery size I need. And usually size that between like 2 and 4 days of usage before you need to recharge. And then you start thinking about how you're going to get power back into them. Like anything else, you want kind of several redundant ways that aren't relying on each other. So for instance, shore power is one that a lot of people use. If you hook up to a dock, there's something you can plug into 120 volt, and it will charge your battery, just like a regular battery charger that you might see like in an automotive repair shop or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Then you'll have the alternator on your engine. There's all different types of alternators you can get. Some really sophisticated ones with external regulators that can produce very high amperage that can recharge your batteries very quickly. Some people think that that's the best bet for power, and that's their main source of recharging their batteries. And then you'll have, the solar and the wind options, which we've kind of discussed. And then another option that people do is generators, and that can range from people who get like the Honda E107 suitcase generators to somebody who has an actual diesel engine installed on the boat, and the sole purpose of that diesel engine is to generate electricity.
Mm-hmm.
It's not hooked up to a propeller or anything. It just generates power.
That's kind of interesting. I want to dive into that for a second. Why actually have a separate diesel engine? I mean, if you've already got an engine that's got an alternator on it, why have a separate one just for generating power as opposed to having a generator?
I'm not a huge gearhead in diesels, so this is a subject that I'm a little bit off on. But essentially, it comes down to if you have a generator set up, it's geared to always work at one constant RPM. Where if you have a boat engine, it's something that's meant to be run at variable speed.
Oh yeah, okay.
And there's a difference between what you can actually generate for power out of those two. So, for instance, the alternator that's on your diesel engine, a really expensive alternator for that might be a 100 amp alternator, where you can get a 100 amp generator would be on the small side for some of these marine generators.
Mm-hmm.
They're generally stuff that's running 10,000, 15,000 watt range. So they're pretty big generators that you go to having an actual separate generator on board. Something like a Honda E107i, which is a common one that you see a lot of people have with smaller boats, that would take forever to recharge your batteries if you used it for that purpose. So, for instance, my boat, if I were to use something that size, it would take probably 6 or 7 hours of running that generator just to recharge 50% of my battery capacity.
Oh, and that's a lot of fuel. Of fuel.
Yeah, especially if you're running diesel and having to carry gasoline as well for the. Nah, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's a guy out there. He has his own business up in Maine, Compass Marine. He has a lot of how-to articles. He has a really good how-to article on his site about how you size solar systems. He goes into this whole equation where he says, what most people will do is they'll figure, one, here's how much usage I'm doing. They do a spreadsheet like the one that I have. And they say, I need to recharge my batteries. You generally don't discharge deep cycle batteries more than 50% because that actually starts to damage the batteries.
Huh.
So if you have, two 200 amp hour batteries, those are only good for 200 amp hours. Even though you have a total capacity of 400, when you start going below 50%, you start to damage the battery.
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to keep it in that 200 amp hour range that you're going to need to charge. If you have 200 amp hours down, I have a 60 amp alternator. I'm willing to run that for 2 hours. So I'd run my engine for 2 hours to charge those batteries. That would give me, 120 amps. So I need to come up with that last 80 amps, and you then size your solar panels to come up with those. So that's how you figure out how much solar you want and what size alternator you might want doing an equation like that.
So I guess, is there a limit for, obviously there's a space limit for the solar panels, and I guess you also get into the weight issues of solar panels, but is there, you were talking earlier about 2 panels, is there a point at which you've just put too many panels on the boat?
Oh yeah, if you have a large boat and you have very efficient systems, so for instance you have all LED lighting, you have pretty high efficiency like refrigeration units, you could put more panels on the boat than you could physically use.
Okay.
Now, with panels on sailboats, they're generally a little less efficient than panels on houses, and that's because boats move, and it's a little bit more difficult to set up like a tilting system on a boat.
Mm-hmm.
So, with houses, a lot of times, you'll tilt and you'll angle that at the right angle to get the optimum performance out of that solar panel. On boats, you'll see them mounted flat, and that's so that you get the most performance over your entire day. Because of, your boat is generally moving all the time, and if you try to tilt it, you might end up tilting it in the wrong direction if you don't move in the same direction as the sun. So a lot of times you're better off just mounting them flat. Or if you can really get smart and set up a good system, you have one that they can be flat, but then when you want to, you can adjust them so that you can get them at a more optimal angle. If you're on the boat and you care about taking that time and adjusting, you're getting a better angle.
That's pretty, I would have never thought of that before, but that makes perfect sense. The boat's out and it's moving and bobbing around and stuff.
Yeah, the other problem too is with solar panels, shading can really decrease the performance of the solar panel. So even a very small amount of shading can have huge effects on how much power you're generating. You have to be cognizant of where shadow lines from the mast and your rigging lines and things like that are going to fall in relation to where you're going to place your panel. So everybody looks at like there's a big open deck space between the mast and the companionway. And I know a lot of people look at that space and say, oh, you can put like 10 panels right there. Well, some of that area is going to be shaded all the time. So any of the panels you put there, you're going to be lucky to get 50% efficiency out because of the shading issue. Where if you build like a metal arch on the stern of the boat and you put 2 panels up there, those panels may give you better power than putting like 5 panels underneath the boom. And then there's a lot of discussion about what's called bimini mounted panels. So a bimini is shading that you have over the cockpit area. So on my boat, it's the 1-inch stainless steel frame with canvas over it. And I can fold it up or I can have it out depending on what I want. Shade in the cockpit, or if it's a little bit cold and we want the sun to come in, we can fold it up. If you want to put solar panels on there, generally you have to build another whole stainless steel frame to really be able to support the weight that you put in there. There are new panels that are coming out that are flexible, not quite cloth flexible, but like semi-flexible panels. This company Solbian makes them. They have some very high efficient ones that you can mount almost directly onto that bimini. You know, some people have even mounted them with just Velcro right onto the bimini, and they give you really good efficiency. If your storm's coming and you need to take your stuff down, you're just pulling off Velcro as opposed to getting out wrenches to take everything down. And then when you bring them down below, it's a soft panel that you could just slide underneath one of the mattresses. And they're thin. They're like maybe 1/4 inch thick. You can slide them right under your mattress, and they're out of the way. They're not going to get damaged, and you didn't damage your boat bringing them down, as opposed to if you had those like hard, rigid panels that are like 2 to 3 inches thick, and you're trying to carry them down, and they have sharp edges, and you're wrecking your woodwork as you're bringing it down.
Do you have to pull so if you have like stationary built-in panels, you have to pull them whenever there's a storm?
Depends on how big the storm is, but if you're going to be in something like a gale, which is generally like 35 knot winds or greater, you're right on that borderline where gale to a tropical storm, you probably need to start thinking about pulling down stuff. Same with your sails. Like you don't just leave your sails up when you get into big storms. You pull all that stuff down. It all goes down in the cabin with you, because if you leave it up, it may not seem like a lot, but any added windage could really cause problems. Plus, your sails can be damaged in that wind. You don't want to end up with damaged sails.
Yeah, that would be kind of a bad idea in a sailboat, it would seem like.
Yeah, sails are expensive. They generally will cost you, several $1,000s to replace. So anything you can do to stop that from happening, you want to do.
Do you keep an extra mainsail on your boat?
I don't. I do know people that do. For my last boat, I had 2 mainsails and 3 jibs, or actually 2 jibs and a genoa. I know a lot of people who, for storms, will keep these things called gale sails, where they can go over that furled head sail and give you a small, very strong sail. And then there's also things called trysails, where it goes up in a second track on the mast next to your mainsail, and gives you, again, a small, very strong sail. So there are people that'll keep those as kind of a safety precaution. And then there are some people that do keep full extra sails if they have them. It comes down to that space equation. Like if you think you have enough space that you can give up keeping another full set of sails, do it. If you don't, you're going to have to just be prepared that if something major happens, you're going to have to either make a repair on your own or find a way to get a new sail or get your sail repaired in a port.
How hard is it to actually repair a sail? I mean, I guess it also depends on how damaged the sail is, obviously, but I mean, just a kind of a tear or something like that in it.
So we carry a couple of different emergency setups for sails. There's tape that you can get. It comes pretty wide. I think the widest I've seen is like a foot wide, and then it's like a 15 or 20 foot section. That's a tape that's made specially. If you have a rip, you could put it right over the sail. You put it on both sides of the rip and kind of flatten it out, and it would hold as an emergency repair. They also have needle and thread in all kits. We have one of those on the boat, so that if we ever had a rip at a seam or something like that, because that's a lot of times where you'll have issues where the seam will blow out.
Okay.
We could, because the sail's not one solid piece of cloth. It's generally a bunch of pieces that have been strategically cut and sewn to give a shape that's specific to your boat.
Okay.
So if you have a rip that's starting to develop at a seam and you have thread and needle kit, you could re-sew that. There are even people that do carry full sewing machines with them on the boat, and that's something that we've gone back and forth about. Do we want to have a sewing machine on the boat?
Mm-hmm. That seems like a lot of extra weight for...
Right.
But one of the most expensive things to get repaired is any of your canvas. So you have sails, you have dodgers, you have biminis. These things do get worn from time to time. Last year we had our dodger repaired. They just restitched 4 sections and replaced one window, and it cost me $800. So that wasn't even like, there was no rips or anything that they had to repair. It was just one window that the windows are made out of what's called ensign glass generally. It's like a clear plexiglass type of material. So they just literally cut the threads that were holding that one in, put it down on a big sheet of this material, traced it out, cut a new one, and sewed it in. And it was $800 for them to do that and then restitch some other areas. One of the other problems you have is a lot of the thread will get UV damage and start to degrade, while the rest of the cloth is still good. So you might need to restitch stuff on otherwise good cloth. And if you don't have the ability to do that, it could result in the cloth eventually becoming damaged. So that's why, there's a lot of dedicating weight to a sewing machine is something that there's a lot of discussion around with cruisers, because it can be something that's very effective to have and very, you end up saving more money than you do spending on doing an alternative thing.
Yeah, and as a kid, my mother taught me to sew, and I can tell you the difference between doing it by hand versus doing it by a machine is a huge time difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't even know. I couldn't even contemplate doing some of these by machine. I mean, my Genoa, right now we just took our sails off because our boat's out of the water. It came out on Monday. I have my Genoa going to a sailmaker here locally to get restitched. I was looking at what's involved, and there's one section that's about a 33-foot length that has to be stitched in a straight line 3 times. So I couldn't imagine trying to do something like that by hand.
Yeah, you'd be at it a while.
Yeah.
There's also I'm sure with the sailmakers themselves, they're using a variety of machines, because I know even at my parents' company, there's probably a dozen different kinds of sewing machines that all have a very specific purpose, aside from just a generic sewing machine. I'm sure it's probably ends up being something similar in sailing.
Oh yeah. Plus, just a whole table setup, I imagine, where, the one time I've been to a sailmaker around here to have some work done, he just had a sewing machine that was sunken into the floor, and the whole floor was like a giant, like almost like basketball court size hardwood floor where you could lay out sails and then pull them through the machine. It was a massive setup just to be able to work on sails.
Yeah, I would imagine you'd need a pretty big space to work on a sail. Some of those sails just become huge.
Yeah, and this particular guy, he had been around for a long time. I know he had worked on a lot of racing boats. A lot of sails now are actually made in like Taiwan or China and then shipped over. Mm-hmm. So people aren't getting sails made locally as much anymore. Even this guy, most of the time when you go in and you talk to him about a sail, it's a sail he's going to buy from someone else and then resell to you.
Okay. Let's get into the crazier prepper side of things. I know, Jason, you had all kinds of questions around foraging and stuff, and I actually had some questions around stepping onto islands that maybe may or may not be owned and questions. But anyway, Jason, I'll let you kick it off with asking about the foraging questions.
Before you even get to that, if you're planning on going into another country's waters anyways, how does all that work? From being a non-sailor, how do you prepare for that, and what are the things that you need to be cognizant of when you're not in, say, your coastal waters?
Most of the places that I've had this experience would be like in the Caribbean, like going from island to island, where you might go from like St. John's over to Tortola, mm-hmm. and you're crossing from the U.S. Virgin Islands to the British Virgin Islands. Mm-hmm. Each time you do that, there are certain ports that are designated as where they have customs officers or port authorities where you can check in. Mm-hmm. Now, some places like the British Virgin Islands, you can check in once for the British Virgin Islands, and then go and spend as much time as you want there or as much time as your permit allows. Generally, you apply for either like a week or a month or a 6-month permit. In the British Virgin Islands, they have specific ones that you would go for. And then once you're done, you go back to the office to check out and then leave. In some places like the Dominican Republic, you have to check in each time you come in or leave a port. So if you pull into Leperon, which is a big cruising destination, a lot of people stop there because it's the first stop when you make the jump. It's the easiest stop when you make the jump from Turks and Caicos over to the Dominican Republic. And when you do that, you have to check in at that particular port. If you're going to leave, you have to check out. And then even if you're just going down the coast 20 miles to check into to go to another harbor, then you have to check in and check out again.
Oh, wow.
Every country is completely different. There's a good site called Noonsite, NOONSITE.com. It's a site that was made for and designed by cruisers for putting all of this information in one place.
Got it.
So if you want to know like what the requirement is to bring my dog to the Bahamas, you can go there and you can see, all right, here's what I have to do to check in. Here's the permit I have to get to bring my dog. You know, here's the procedures you go through to get the permit, and everything's laid out for you very nicely.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one place that they'll go. There's also published cruising guides most sailors will buy where it'll tell you, you know, it's a written book, and it tells you, you know, to get into this harbor, here's where you check in, here's what the fee is. You know, every one of these ports obviously has a fee to go with it when you check in, and they've gone up quite a bit in the last 20 years. You know, there's stories of guys from the 70s where they're like, oh, yeah, I used to check in the Bahamas for $5. Now I think it's like $300.
Wow. Okay. How strict are they about that? I mean, how much trouble would you get into if you just, say, sailed up to not necessarily a harbor, but like a beachside, I don't know, town, and then just took your dinghy in?
If you get caught, you're going to jail.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's not a fine. You're in trouble. Yeah, it's not worth it generally in any of the areas that I've researched at, like any of the Caribbean areas.
Mm-hmm.
I've never found like, oh, you know, if you check in, it's $100 fee. If we catch you not checking in, it's $200. It's never that. It's you're going to jail for a year if we catch you not checking in.
That's pretty serious.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess that makes sense. You're sneaking into somebody else's country without really notifying them.
Right. And for the most part, this is one of those things where it's not overly burdensome generally. There are some times you'll hear about, like, you know, you get in at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, and the harbor master's not on again until 10 o'clock on Monday, which means technically you can't leave your boat until then. So, you know, you're stuck anchored in your boat waiting for the guy to get into his office so you can go and check in. There's also other places where they'll have a sign up with a phone number, and you call the phone number, and the guy's like down the road, and he just, you know, puts on his pants and comes into work and checks you in and leaves.
Cool.
You know, so the general procedure is when you're pulling into a foreign harbor that you haven't been in before, one of the first things you do is you put up a yellow flag, which is called the quarantine flag. So that's the signal to everybody in that harbor that you have not gone through customs yet. Once you get settled in, you know, you get your anchor set or you pick up a mooring, you get your yellow flag up, the captain is allowed to go into land to check in for the boat. If everything goes smoothly and easily, the captain just comes back with, you know, he goes ashore or she goes ashore with everybody's onboard passports, with the boat's paperwork, and with a filled out, generally you can get them online beforehand, so you can have a filled out customs form for that particular country. And then you go into their office, you give them all their paperwork, they go through it. Sometimes it's as little as 10 minutes. Sometimes it may take hours, and they may want to go to your boat, inspect your boat, get all of these details that seem like they don't mean anything to you, but for whatever reason, they flagged you as somebody they're going to follow up on further. So you never know if you're going to end up having customs officials on your boat or not when you check into a harbor, which is one of those reasons why the gun question becomes such a problematic one, because, you know, you could try to smuggle in a gun, you know, just by hiding it in your boat, but if all of a sudden you have 6 harbor masters that show up with dogs that can sniff out gunpowder, you're in a lot of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so then after you've been cleared in, if everything goes well and you're cleared to come in, you'll have a permit generally that allows you to stay for, anywhere from 7 days to indefinitely, and you just have to check out when you leave. It all depends on what the rules are for that particular country. You keep that paperwork on your boat. You then change from the yellow flag to what's called the courtesy flag, which is you generally, one of the schemes is you end up buying this from the customs official usually for more money than it's worth. Some people will actually buy them ahead of time, or they'll make their own. They'll just try to take like some cloth and sew up their own customs flag of whatever country they're in, and then you fly that flag to show that you've checked in. And then you're good to stay for as long as as long as you can or want to. Then when you go to leave, you check out and you go to the next country. Usually it's not a big deal. I know for us, we've talked about the fact that my wife is probably going to be the captain because she's a CPA and deals with bureaucracy much better than I do. So she'll do the one that'll do the checking in and checking out while I just sit on the boat and wait.
It's a nice arrangement for you.
Right?
Yeah. Although, her having to come and bail me out of jail because I say something I shouldn't to a customs official is probably
That'd still be one of us.
Uh-huh.
All right, so that leads me to my next question of, okay, say you come across an island and you don't know what country it really is. It doesn't appear that there's anyone on that island. Can you go camp out on the beach?
Well, generally, you're going to have charts with you, so it'd be kind of hard for you to not know what country that's a part of because the charts will identify the international water lines.
Okay.
So if you're looking at I have my chart book. I can't find it. I thought I had my Caribbean chart book right near me, but I can't see it. But I remember when we were in the British Virgin Islands, I was looking at this, and there's a specific line drawn of where the U.S. Virgin Islands waters are and the British Virgin Islands waters are. Now, generally, you can cross over that line without a big deal, and they said that specifically, like when we were talking to different customs officials down in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. You can go over that line without a major problem. But as soon as you go up and go to shore on the other side of that line, that's when you have a problem.
So they're not that worried about you being in their waters necessarily. It's more about setting foot on their soil.
Especially in areas where, like the Caribbean, where there's so many different international water lines so close to each other. You could be sailing. There's one area that I recall where you're sailing less than a quarter mile from an island that's in British waters, and then to your other side, a quarter mile is St. John. So it's not like there's a big space there. So if you're in a sailboat and you're tacking back and forth, and you cross that line, they're not going to come running over with the Coast Guard and arrest you. They're going to be realistic about it, and but if they see you come from the British Virgin Islands, go over to St. John's, drop your anchor, go swimming and hang out on the beach, you're probably going to have a problem. Because they are watching people do that.
So as far as foraging, and I guess you can tell what island it is, but as far as realizing whether or not you're looking at public land or private land, or like Jason was saying, just if you're in those waters and you've already checked in with that country, how do you figure out, hey, is it okay for me to just pitch a tent on the beach over there or go kind of screw around on the island?
Some of that stuff is generally stuff that they'll talk about at customs when you check in. The other thing is the cruising guide. Like I was mentioning before, they have these books that you get, and it'll say, hey, this is a great beach to, have a campfire on and hang out on, nobody really minds. Or, there's some nice wild fruit that grows on this island that you can eat. But the other thing for kind of more modern resources is there is this website called Active Captain. So it's activecaptain.com. And essentially they've taken those cruising guides, and they've kind of mixed it with Facebook. And it's a website where you can go on, and everything's kind of map-driven. So you can look at a map of the area you want to go, and you'll see little flags. There's some flags that stand for anchorages, some stand for marinas, some stand for, like, hazard notes. Like, if there's an uncharted rock, they'll tell you that on the chart. So you can, like, pull it up, and it'll be somebody's local knowledge who is in that area and says, hey, there's an uncharted rock right here. Just be careful. You don't hit it. because you do see that quite a bit. Like you'll find people who have hit uncharted rocks all over the place. And that's where you can get a lot of that type of info. They might say, when you're in this harbor, you might find a good spot to go camping over here. In the Caribbean, from what I've seen, especially those deserted islands, there's never really an issue. When we were in the British Virgin Islands, there were a number of times that we looked at night when we were going back to our boat from whatever bar we had stumbled home from. The British Virgin Islands are nothing but a continual booze cruise.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun, but make sure your liver is nice and prepared before you go down there. But we would look over and you'd see fires on some of the shores in the harbors where you'd be like, oh, somebody's hanging out over there having a fire. Oh, do we want to go see them? It's like, I don't really think we should. I think we should find our way to our boat because we've had way too many rum punches.
Got it. What about fishing in different waters?
So each country obviously has their own fishing regulations. And I know we talked to Joe on the one about the Bahamas last time. So in the Bahamas, for instance, one thing that's extremely hard to fish for is conch because it's been so overfished for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to get permits. There's a specific season, and you're not allowed to take very many. But on the other hand, lionfish is an invasive species, and you can take as much as you want without a permit.
Got it.
So, you can do a fair amount of foraging, and then there's other fish. There's lobsters and things like that. Some of them will have specific seasons, some of them won't. The biggest tool that most cruisers use is the Hawaiian sling. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that.
Mm-mm.
It's essentially like you can get them in 4 foot or 6 foot or 9 foot intervals, the ones I've seen. They're fiberglass rod. They have like surgical tubing on one end and like usually a 3 or 4 pronged spear head on the other end. And you just pull it up, down along your arm. So, you'd be holding it up near the spearhead and it would be going down the length of your arm. And you just let go of it and the surgical tubing makes it shoot forward at whatever you're aiming. You got to get fairly close. You're within, depending on which ones you have, you're within 3 or 4 feet of whatever you're trying to kill. But they're actually pretty easy to use, and once you get the hang of it, you can catch a lot of fish using it.
I actually think I saw Les Stroud make, it must have been a homemade one. Obviously a homemade one on one episode where he was, I think it was one of his earlier episodes where he was on a deserted island for like a few weeks or like a week or something like that.
Yeah, they're really universal. You can use them for a lot of fish. You can use them on like shellfish, like lobster, like Caribbean lobster. You can catch those fairly easy as well. So anything that you can kind of get down, especially in the reef areas where you're a few feet away from them, you can get a lot of food that way. There's a lot of people, like I said before, that live on doing that every day. That's how they get their meals.
That's really neat.
Yeah, yeah.
Then there's other foraging. There are some guides to how to forage in the area. So if you were trying to get things like the right types of kales or wild fruits and vegetables, there are some guides that you can get for the areas. I don't have any of those that I can think of right now. If I do think of any, I'll send you over a link to them.
Okay.
And then there's fishing as well. Like we have a regular standard surf casting rod that I keep on my boat, and we also have a hand line. Or a lot of times when we're sailing, I'll let out the hand line. And when you get down into areas like the Bahamas and the Caribbean, you're catching some pretty good fish. People have caught, decent sized tuna on that. They've caught a lot of like mahi-mahi, or some people call them dolphin. You can catch a lot of those. So there's a lot of people that'll do that and fill up freezers while they're out, so they have, while they're going between different islands, they'll catch 2 or 3 fish, they'll slaughter them, they'll clean them, they'll put them in a freezer and have that meat for the next couple of weeks.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I guess that goes back to we were talking about the last episode. You were saying something there was gosh, it's slipping my memory now, but it was basically like living off a sailboat for $500 a month.
Yeah, that's one of the topics you'll see in a lot of the cruising forums, where it'll be like living on $500 a month while cruising, and in a lot of places it's you can even do it for cheaper than that if you're doing it smart.
But I guess you still you're always going to run into the issue of fresh vegetables and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's always going to be an issue. There's, as I was saying before, like each time you go into a new country, there's a fee to get in there. So if you're going into a lot of new countries, you could get a lot of those fees building up. Those are the type of things that could suck up budget.
Right.
And then just buying, one of the things you have to do is avoid typical Western food. Like, you can't eat bread because bread down in the Caribbean is very expensive. Most of it's actually imported. If you can't find white bread down there that's not imported from the States.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I guess they don't have, most of their land is not going to be allocated to grain production.
No, yeah, you don't see a lot of those type of farms. You do see a fair amount of cattle farms, some cows and some other, like, goats, things like that. In the British Virgin Islands, chickens were wild everywhere. Everywhere, like, every time you turned around, there were chickens running everywhere. So if you ever wanted one of those, I'm sure it would be just a matter of catching one. Although, British Virgin Islands, so you can't have guns, so don't try to shoot it. You have to net it somehow.
A slingshot, man.
A slingshot. Well, you could use that Hawaiian sling if you got close enough to the chicken.
Right. I bet you could. As close as you, because these are fairly domesticated too. They're used to being around people, so you could get pretty close to these. Like, we were hand feeding a chick one day that was just a wild chick that was running near our boat.
What other, as far as foraging, and I guess that was a pretty interesting, the active captain link that you said about, as far as like being able to go step out onto a piece of land and kind of even do the more primitive wild foraging for vegetables or just wild edibles in general.
Yeah, that cruising guide will have some of that stuff, and it can help you. But there are some people who have written specific books about foraging in the Caribbean. So again, if I come across one of those, I'll send it over to you so you can put a link in the notes. But I can't think of any off the top of my head.
That's very cool. Very cool.
There is one other foraging thing which I want to find out more about. Apparently, in one island in the Bahamas, they have wild pigs, and these things are like 500 or 600 pound wild pigs.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
I want to find out if there's any rules about taking those, because that could be a nice boost right there.
They probably appreciate it if you take them.
Exactly.
If it's anything like Texas, where we're like, we don't care what you use.
Dynamite, whatever.
If you want to use dynamite hand grenades, just go right ahead. We don't, just get rid of them as many as you can, as fast as you can.
Yeah, I have a feeling that might be the theory down there as well, because they're not something that people generally like having around.
Right.
But with no guns, you'd be left spear hunting.
I don't have a problem.
Well, the Bahamas is one of those places where you can bring like a shotgun if you call it a hunting tool, not a defensive weapon.
Right. Or like we were joking about before, they're racist about black guns. If it's got wood, then it's okay. But if it's black, then no, I'm sorry, we don't allow your kind here.
Hey man, 12 gauge, 3.5 inch slug. There ain't nothing in anywhere that's not taken out.
True. Pretty interesting. And I guess there's probably little stuff like that all over the world, where there's random wild animals that they're just like, kill it, we don't care.
Right. Well, and there's always the rat mongoose thing.
Rat mongoose thing?
Yeah, rats, man.
What are you talking about?
Real true foraging, man.
I am in a
protein.
complete rat mongoose.
Protein.
Okay,
Yeah.
I got you. All right.
Every island's got Norwegian rats. They not a problem.
Okay. Okay. The Norwegian rats. I know what you're talking about. Yeah. Okay. It just took me a minute. I was trying to figure out what you were talking about.
I mean, I'm the food survival guy, dude. I mean, if it's edible,
Hey, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that. I'm eyeing the squirrels in my backyard. I'm fattening them up. I'm just letting them think that I'm kind enough to let them have all the pecans that. I could not believe the damn things ate all my pecans this year. Somehow I have like 8 or 12 of the fattest squirrels you've ever seen, because I have these 2 huge pecan trees in my backyard. This year, like usually I'll get a couple pounds shelled of pecans out of my trees, and it's only a couple pounds because that's the point at which I'm just tired of cracking pecans.
Right.
And this year it was literally nothing. It was like the roving squirrel horde just came in and like a band of locusts and ate all my pecans. Anyway, I'm going to stop complaining about that. We're going to go back to sailing and killing random animals in places. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Is there a type of seaweed that's edible?
Oh, yeah. There's several different types. I know kale is a big one that a lot of people eat, that you can find different types of edible kale on the East Coast. West Coast, I know there's a lot more of that. But there's other kinds of seaweed that I remember my grandmother used to take right from the beach around New England and would make it as part of meals.
Okay.
I think a lot of it is actually pretty high in vitamin C too, which I don't think most people associate with kelp or seaweed.
And that's one of the major vitamins that you're looking for.
Well, you don't want to get scurvy.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Just drink lots of rum punches that have juice in it. That's all.
I like his idea better.
Hey, I agree. I'm just talking about in a survival situation. Hey, go get the kill. All right, so I mean, you can actually skim some of that off going into an island.
Oh yeah, there's lots of different kinds you can get. Again, generally they grow more towards structure,
Right?
so you're going to see them more near beaches, near rocks, that type of stuff than you're going to find in the wild. But there is stuff like that you'll see down there you can eat. That's for sure. Occasionally you'll come across just huge big patches of various seaweed, and some of that is edible. That's also where you'll find a lot of mahi-mahi generally, too.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'm throwing a line over. I'm going to go ahead and scoop up some of that, seaweed and hook me a fish and throw all that in a stew pot.
You're gonna eat a dolphin?
Dude, I'll eat it.
I'm just messing with you. I don't really get it. They're not actually dolphins, are they?
No.
They're actually
mahi-mahi.
fish.
No.
They just look like a dolphin.
Right.
They don't even really look like dolphins. I don't know how they got that nickname.
Oh, really?
Oh.
They're green, and they have big, huge fins that come the whole length of their back. Like, they don't just have, like, a dorsal fin.
Right.
Huh.
They're actually truly dolphins, and the things that we associate with dolphins are actually porpoises.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
that's good distinction.
That's where
There we go. Oh, wow, that's a totally random bit of trivia, Jason. I didn't know you had that in you.
Dude, I have all
You
kinds
are
of
a source of random shit.
just
That is
random
true.
shit, man.
That is
Completely.
true. But that one caught me by surprise, I'm going to have to admit.
Thanks, sir.
Very impressive.
Thanks,
Very
sir.
impressive. All right. I interrupted again. Go on with your foraging self.
Okay, so do you know any resources where you can actually find which ones are edible?
There's a book that I know I've looked at recently, and the name of it's just escaping me. I got to find it, and I'll email you guys over a link for it.
Okay, we'll make
Pretty
sure
sure
it
I
ends
have
up in the
something
show notes.
bookmarked on my work computer for that.
Oh, okay.
My last, foraging and, just my true rugged, bailout kind of thing was water. I know there's a desalination systems out there.
Yeah, that's the best way to deal with it. Is you find you get yourself a decent water maker, like a nice 12-volt or engine-driven one that you can run pretty reliably on your boat without needing to run a generator or anything like that, and you can make all the water you want. I mean, there's standard equation still applies on boats, about a gallon per person per day.
Mm-hmm.
So most of those water makers will make, I think the smallest capacity I've ever seen in one of those water makers was 3 gallons an hour.
Wow.
We talked about that a little bit last time, and actually I have two questions. One seemingly, well, no, it's still related, but it's kind of an offshoot, which was, and you just brought it up, which is the 1 gallon of water per day. How much water do you actually find that you use per day on a boat?
My wife and I both drink quite a bit of water, probably more than the average person. So when we're up here, we generally will have 1 gallon Poland Springs jugs that we get to put in the fridge, more out of convenience than anything.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll go through somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 of those a day, depending on how much we're drinking. And then from the actual use of the water perspective, we have 55 gallons that we keep in our tank. So we have a 20 gallon hot water heater and a 35 gallon freshwater tank.
Okay.
We'll fill those up on average once a week, but we're doing things like dishes and taking showers on the boat. Usually they're showers on the transom after you go swimming. We also use fresh water to flush our head when we're in port. The way that marine heads work, when you flush the toilet, you generally have 2 ways that you can have it. You can have what's called a dry flush, where it just sucks stuff out of the bowl. Then you can have a wet flush, where it's pushing water down in and sucking water out of the bowl at the same time. The water that it pushes down in comes through a hole in the bottom of the boat, and it's pulling whatever water is around the boat. So when you're in port, you tend to not have the cleanest water because some other guy down the dock might not be using his holding tank. He might be letting his stuff just go straight overboard. And so we tend to not use that water when we're in port. If we're anchored out someplace in a nice pristine, private harbor where there's not marinas everywhere, we use the fresh water to flush the head that way. But generally, we use water from our holding tank just because we don't like the smell.
Mm-hmm. That actually explains why we were on somebody's boat and they were like, "Nah, don't flush that way," or
Yeah.
they were asking us to go ashore and use the restroom.
Well, the other part of it too is if you're doing it right, you're putting whatever goes into the toilet into a holding tank, and you're either having that holding tank pumped out, or you're going out past 3 miles and then discharging.
Okay.
And those holding tanks aren't very big, so the one on my boat is 14 gallons. You can fill a 14-gallon tank much quicker than you think.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense, especially when you're factoring in urine and stuff like that. That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. It used to be for us, the head was kind of when we first got the boat, it was more kind of an emergency situation.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we've been living on the boat the last 2 summers, that kind of went out the window because I still take walks quite a bit to use the shore facilities, but, my wife generally tends to just use the facilities on the boat a little bit more often.
Yeah, I would imagine at some point it just becomes a giant pain to have to go walk what's probably about the equivalent of a city block to go use the restroom.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a 1/4-mile walk there and back to go to the restroom from my dock.
That's a long walk to go relieve yourself.
Oh yeah.
But that's also where the showers are, so, it's just kind of my routine. I'll get up in the morning, pack my shower bag, and I'll go up there and I'll use those shore showers and everything.
Mm-hmm.
If we're out someplace anchored in a harbor, you're not going to shore for that. You're going to use what's on your boat.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That makes sense. So, and I guess that brings up the other part of the question as far as when we were talking about water usages. How much do those desalination units, like for a decent one, actually end up running?
Like $3,000 to $5,000.
Okay, yeah, I guess that's about what I was expecting.
Yeah, they're not outrageous, but they're, there's ways that you can get them cheaper. There's a company called DIY Watermaker, and they just sell you all the components, not in a fancy case, and then you put it together yourself.
Okay, all right.
And then you can buy really nice, well-done ones. The one that I'm looking at is on the small side. I think it's around a 3-gallon an hour unit. It's 12-volt unit. It's about $4,500. The big advantage I like of this one is if for whatever reason I didn't have power, there's a hand crank, a hand pump, and I could actually hand pump to make water.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And I thought that was kind of again, from a if all else fails type of view, at least this way you could always make water if you're stuck out in the middle of the ocean in your boat.
Yeah, definitely. Because that would be kind of important.
And then there's companies that make like small little like emergency pumps that, you could pump for 20 minutes and get a gallon of water yourself, just hand pump type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That on boats, the whole prepper thing kind of has that negative connotation, so they rename things.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of having a bug out bag on a boat, you have a ditch bag.
Okay.
So if I had to ditch from the boat, so a lot of people will have their ditch bags. They're same concept as a bug out bag.
Right.
You got a knife, you got a fire starter, you got probably an emergency GPS in it, you have an emergency radio in it, some flares, and then a lot of people will put things like some protein bars, and then one of those small desalination units, the hand pump style ones.
Okay.
And the idea is if you ever had to leave your main boat and jump into your life raft or your thingy that you're towing along with you, you'd at least have this minimum amount of stuff to help you survive until you're rescued, or survive until you make it to land.
Yeah. All right. Well, that makes sense. Well, man, I know it's getting late. I think we had actually some more topics that we wanted to cover, but this is like the second time we've run so long. I'm like, man, we may need a part 3. Because I know we had
stuff, man. God,
we had some crazier stuff we wanted to get into, and we were even going to talk more about guns today because we've gotten into more stuff about guns when it comes to sailing. But so I guess we're just going to have to leave that cliffhanger there for a part 3 at some time in the next month or 2 or something.
Well, this time of year is a good time to get to me because I have the boat out of the water. I'm just working on a few projects. So usually you can get me from now until April if you want.
Awesome.
You can have me back on again.
Awesome. I
That is
sure
awesome.
appreciate it, Jesse.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Help us bring you better information about preparedness. If you have an author, blogger, podcaster, video blogger, or any other person you'd like to hear on the show, we'd love to have them on. Contact the person you'd like to hear on the show and tell them about In the Rabbit Hole Urban Survival Podcast. Tell them to visit intherabbithole.com/guest. Don't wait. Do it today, and let's grow the show together. From the Lone Star State. Till next time, stay safe and sound.